So, for the session and the folks who are joining virtually, thank you for popping in online. Before we get started, I would encourage you, so you're going to see a lot of QR codes and you're going to assume they're all for the same thing. There are really kind of two primary codes that I have for you guys today. This one on the title slide is for a resource document that goes to our work for this particular session. I am well aware that at a conference, it's a little bit like a fire hose. You're going to get exposed to a ton of stuff. At the end of this time together, it's going to be a bit of a blur. So I wanted to create something where you would have all the resources, all of the information in one place. So if you can scan the QR code, great. It should open up the resource document / playlist for this session. If you are having any trouble with the QR code just being kind of wonky or not working well, it is bit.ly / all caps BSTE and then all lowercase activate and the number 1. So you put that into your browser window and it should also take you there. You can also take a photo with your phone just so you have it in case something happens and you want to get back to it later. Great. I also strategically just in a couple places around the room have like a yellow post-it note down here on row 1. So if you're like, oh, I closed my tab, I can't find it, you can always come down here and grab that link, or I can pull this back up at the end. But just so that you know what you're going to be seeing, hopefully, if you get to the right spot, is this resource document, since there are almost 60 of you on there. I assume you've gotten there. For our folks in the room, if when we do the engagement activities, you'd like to participate on Mentimeter, wonderful. For my folks on Zoom, I would love for you guys to share your thoughts that way so you can actively engage too. You'll also see I have my entire presentation here for you if you need a closer, bigger version. And you'll also notice it also has the QR code and the short link right there on the title slide. And then I like to kind of have everything in a one-stop shop. So if you want to make a copy of the Google document, you'll notice that there is that column that says notes, thoughts, wondering. So if you want to just capture your thinking as we go through today, you can make a copy and then have your own editable version. So that is what you're looking at. And for each section, not only do I have our activities, but I also have the links you'll need and any curated resources that I think might be helpful for you after today if you want to dig into any of these topics in more detail. All right, so that's the setup. This session is covering a very big topic. So we're going to do our best to kind of give you a taste of each part of this. Activating agency, differentiation, cultivating community, and inspiring inquiry with blended learning. But before we dig into that, let me just put a bug in your ear. If you have questions today that you're like, I don't want to ask in front of all these people, or I'm on the Zoom and I'm not running the Zoom obviously, but you want to ask your question, I am super easy to find online. If you're on X, which used to be Twitter, Instagram, you want to go straight to my website, know that you can find me, ask questions, run something by me, ask for a resource. I'm happy to support you guys moving forward. So whenever I do a training, a session, I teach a class for my graduate students, I always start with a welcome activity just to model the importance of human connection. And I also want to establish, why are we spending this hour together? What is it about blended learning that allows for these things like agency, differentiation, building community, and inquiry? So what I want to spend the first 3 moments talking about is for those of us in the room, you can turn in your chair, the person next to you. I just want you to have a chance to say hi. If we're opening up the Zoom rooms, maybe the folks on Zoom can jump in there and say hello. And I want you to, once you kind of introduce yourself, like where do you work, what's your role, then I want you to talk about what is most challenging about your specific role. And you'll notice there's a QR code. This will take you straight to the Mentimeter if you want to share your ideas there too. But if you're in the room and you just want to chat, that's wonderful. And then what makes it challenging to teach, reach, and ensure all students move toward or make progress toward firm, sustainable underlying goals. So share on Mentimeter, chat with the folks around you. I'll give you 3 minutes and then we're going to dive in.
It's over there. It's over here. Okay, don't make Yes. I think you know Oh, yeah.
All right, I'm gonna have you guys wrap up those conversations. All right, so got to hear some of your chats. Thank you for moving around your chairs, making the space work. This is what's being shared online, right? So some of the folks in here who might just be like, I'm a little introverted. I just want to do Mentimeter. We have our folks on Zoom. You know what's interesting is I don't think it matters what question I ask in terms of education. The biggest word in the cloud is almost always time, right? Like we don't have enough time for all the things we are expected to do. We have burnout, we have buy-in, we have kind of leadership behaviors. Where is teenagers? That was like cracking me up. They're my favorite age. I have teenagers. I always taught teenagers. Like I find them wildly funny and entertaining, but they definitely can, you know, stress a person out. We have training, burnout, pacing, apathy. So lots of the challenges. We have EL, you know, second language students on there and meeting their specific needs. I would argue a lot of the challenges that we face, how many people in the room are actual like teachers in a classroom? And how many, exactly. How many of you guys are coaches working to support the teachers? Awesome. And how many leadership, other kind of roles do we have in here? All right, so kind of like a nice blend. So when I work with teachers and coaches, I would encourage you to do this as well. If you are leading any kind of PD and you're trying to get buy-in for other instructional models, is when we're gonna spend time together like this, talking about activating agency and differentiating consistently and building community and driving inquiry with blended learning, the first thing we have to establish with teachers and as coaches is, why is this an important conversation? Why should teachers even think that blended learning is something to consider or spend time on? And so I think we have to kind of acknowledge the paradigm or the instructional model that is still being used predominantly, right? So a lot of teachers, when I go in and work with them as a coach, they are still using the whole group teacher-led, teacher-paced model, if not exclusively, primarily. And so when I work with teachers, I ask them, obviously, if so many teachers are using this model so frequently, there has to be a reason. And so from a teacher perspective, I'm curious, what would you say as a teacher or a coach working closely with teachers or somebody in leadership, what do you think from a teacher perspective is the benefit of that whole group teacher-led, teacher-paced model? And what is challenging about being a teacher in a whole group, teacher-paced, teacher-led model? I'm going to give you 2 minutes for this conversation. And again, for those in the room who just want to connect and be present, feel free to just chat this out. If you are online or you have the resource document and you feel like capturing what your group is chatting about, or you just want to do this on your own, I do have a link to a Jamboard. On slide 1 is where you can capture these benefits and challenges from a teacher perspective. Then after 2 minutes, I'm going to cue you to shift perspectives, and I'm going to ask you to put yourself in the seat of a student and think about, from a student perspective, what would they think are the benefits of that whole group teacher-led lesson? What is it like to be a student in there that's beneficial? And then what are the challenges from a student perspective? So 2 minutes for the teacher perspective, 2 minutes for the student perspective. You can just chat it out and or capture your ideas on the Jamboard that is linked from your resource document right here under the kind of share your ideas under the activity analyzing whole group teacher-led. So 2 minutes teacher-led. What do they think are the benefits and challenges? In 2 minutes, I'll transition you. All right, so let's switch to the student perspective, benefits and challenges. All right, so I'll pull you guys back together. So the interesting thing is when you're a coach or a leader and you do this exercise with teachers, they are so honest. Like the exact same post-its show up for them. And there's almost just mirroring exactly what you guys have up here. There's almost always two challenges and a couple benefits that are always the same. From a teacher perspective, one of the benefits is obviously planning a whole group teacher-led lesson, a one-size-fits-all lesson pretty much, is far easier to do in terms of time, prep, design work. But the most positive or the most appealing part of this from a teacher perspective is all about control, right? Control over the pacing. Teachers are under incredible pressure to cover a massive amount of content. And so by kind of doing it this way, they know they can get through it. And often teachers will say, I know students all heard the same thing. And I'm like, we're adorable. We can say it. It doesn't mean anybody's listening to us, that they're like thinking about it. They're going to retain it, be able to much less apply it. Control over behaviors, right? Control over pacing and curriculum. Those are huge benefits from a teacher perspective. And yet we know we're not meeting everybody's needs in terms of pace, in terms of differentiation, and the level in which the information is being presented in. And then from a student perspective, the benefits are it's easier to hide, right? I can decide as a learner, how much do I want to engage in this experience? There was one on here that was like, everybody's kind of doing the same thing, so I'm not as scared I'm going to get lost. And quite frankly, something that we have to just be honest about when we talk about the difference between a teacher-centered and a learner-centered environment is it is much more cognitively and socially challenging to be a student in a student-centered classroom. And a lot of students aren't used to working that hard. And in the beginning, they don't really enjoy it, right? Because it's hard. It takes starting to like appreciate the reward of what happens when you become that active learner to really start to lean in and understand the value from a student perspective of this approach. The downsides are obvious. I think also it's familiar. It's familiar to teachers. It's familiar to students. I think the downsides are obviously students not feeling like the pacing is a good fit for them. Again, knowing that the level of the work isn't really a great match for where they are as individual learners. So all of those challenges from a teacher perspective, a student perspective, really serve as the why or the value proposition for this time that we have together in exploring how blended learning can allow us to activate all of these things in a classroom that, quite frankly, when we are stuck at the front of the room as educators doing a lot of transferring of information, orchestrating the parts of the lesson, we just don't have time for. And so I like to be really clear about how I define blended learning, just because especially during COVID, it was defined in lots of really interesting ways I wasn't a fan of. So when I define it very simply as active engaged learning online combined with active engaged learning offline, with the goal of giving students more control over those 4 elements of their learning: time, place, pace, path. So they're not going to control all of those things all the time, but the different models within blended learning give them different degrees of control over those different elements, depending on the models that we're using. And I would say 85% of my time here in this space is spent over here in the rotation models, because I think another myth that kind of needs to be addressed is that blended learning only works on some special hybrid schedule, which is not the case. Right? These rotation models, station rotation, flipped learning, whole group rotation, playlist model, work beautifully entirely in a physical classroom. They can obviously extend online in a hybrid schedule, or if you're assigning homework for students, and they can work beautifully in a remote learning scenario, as I found in COVID, which was maybe the most interesting part of that whole little experience from my perspective. And it's also that flexibility of skill set that I think should be really attractive to everybody in education. Like, who knows if we'll hit another pandemic, there'll be a climate crisis issue, there's snow days, or whatever the situation may be, where we might need to lean on these different models to kind of seamlessly transition online again. So for me, really the goal moving from that traditional teacher-led approach to instruction and thinking about blended learning is to move from that teacher-centered experience where there's a lot of pressure on the teacher to be the expert at the front of the room, orchestrating the lesson, and really lean on these models to create student-centered learning experiences where the teacher focus is on facilitating learning, really spending their time in these high impact activities like leading differentiated direct instruction, differentiated modeling sessions, giving students feedback as they work, and conferencing with learners about their progress in the class. So we're here today to kind of just scratch the surface of these 4 kind of aspects of the learning experience that we can more seamlessly build into our lessons and units because we are using these nimble blended learning models. The first, student agency, differentiation, community, and building a dynamic learning community, and then really encouraging students to engage in inquiry so that they are driving the learning, they are asking questions, they are searching for answers. So we'll start with student agency, and for those of us who are really thinking about how do we make learning kind of inclusive and accessible and equitable, I would like to tie this conversation of student agency, which is really the student's ability to make key decisions about their learning, to the reality that is learner variability, right? So how many people in this room have multiple children, right? So great. This is all I needed to know about learner variability, right? I have 2 children, and they were raised in the exact same house with the exact same parents and the exact same opportunities. And these 2 individuals literally could not be any different, right? I have a daughter who you could plop her into any learning environment, she's gonna thrive. She's motivated, she's curious, she's hardworking, she's also super introverted. Then I have my son who not that excited about school. He likes to be interacting with people. He's super extroverted. He loves to work with his hands. He loves to solve real world problems. So when we think about the learner variability, the reality that it's not
That is your super warm coat.
norm,
That is your
all of a sudden
yeah,
it starts
super
to
warm
make
coat.
sense
I was like,
why
oh,
giving students meaningful meaningful choices become so
funny.
incredibly powerful.
Too
Because
funny.
we have this beautiful diversity of students
Alright.
who have different skills and abilities, different learning preferences, language proficiencies, they have different needs, maybe they have different kind of socioeconomic backgrounds, social emotional, all of these pieces. If we're gonna honor
Yeah.
them, we can do best
They
by
took care of you.
embracing student agency and meaningful choice in our design. I love this quote, and I'm gonna
Where'd
let
you
you
go,
guys read
Bodos?
it, and then I'm gonna
Where'd you
modify
go,
it.
Bodos? Or-
No, read that.
Oh, okay.
No.
Gotcha.
This morning, knowing that I didn't have any lunch.
Ah,
So I just
And
walked
I
there.
would even say, as
Chilly out, but not
yeah.
lover
Last night
of
was
curriculum
cold.
design, like
Yes.
that's one of my favorite
This
parts
morning
of
I
this
saw that
work.
Crozet was like
It is
19
a
degrees.
design
Yeah, that feels
opportunity,
frigid.
right? And it feels
It was
like an
pretty cool.
opportunity when we have a
Alright,
robust
let's see.
teaching tool belt with lots of
Um,
instructional models and strategies to
I'm
pull
in
from.
my mail.
It feels more like a
How
challenge
do I
when we're trying to make this
select
one
more than
teacher-led
one
whole
letter?
group teacher-paced model
That is the
fit
question.
for each group of students
The
and for each
influence.
learning objective. So it's not that we never use that particular model, but I want teachers to have a robust tool belt
Holy
full
shit.
of instructional models. So it's almost like, here's this group of students, and here's the learning activities, and here's their needs, and it's like a little
Right
puzzle
click.
we're trying to fit. And which of these learning
And
models,
choose
these
our
instructional
code.
models or strategies is going to work best to try to meet their specific needs. So I'm going to anchor some of what we're talking about today just in the 3 psychological needs that we have to be motivated. Because I think one of the most challenging aspects of being an educator is working with students who we feel like are not motivated to learn. They're not engaged in the classroom. I did my doctoral research study on teacher engagement in blended learning environments, and teacher engagement and student engagement are reciprocal. So when one goes down, the other goes down. When one goes up, the other goes up. And so what we need to understand about human motivation is that people need a degree of autonomy, independence, and agency, the ability to make choices. They also need a degree of competence, which is just their confidence in their ability to do whatever they've been asked to do. And then relatedness, feeling connected to an inclusive community in schools, a learning community. And so when we think about student agency, it can really actually positively impact, obviously, this autonomy realm, but also that competence piece. Because if I'm being asked to do something, but I have 2 options, now I'm likely to feel more confident in my ability to complete one of the options that I've been given instead of having just one pathway to acquire information, process it, demonstrate my learning. So when I work with teachers, often in coaching sessions, we're talking about where would it make sense to give students meaningful choices? And there are really 3 areas that we target. So would it make sense to give them some agency over the what or the content, right? So often we are tasked with covering these huge umbrella topics in our curriculum. So are there moments when we can allow the student to choose the lens they look through or make a key decision about what part of the content they want to really drill into? So for example, in my work as a high school English teacher, I always wanted my kids to understand a little bit about the historical context of whatever it was we were reading. So if we were going to be reading and performing part of Romeo and Juliet, I wanted them to know a little bit about Elizabethan England, and research was part of my standards. So in the beginning of my career, I was like, everybody is going to, research Elizabethan England. And you can imagine how psyched they were about that, right? And then I realized they hate this. They're not excited. How about if I brainstorm a laundry list of topics? Crime and punishment, the plague and other illnesses, the monarchy, fashion, entertainment, and let students research this time period through a lens of interest. When I coached a 2nd grade teacher doing some work on animal and animal habitats in a science unit, the kids got to focus on their specific animal. So as they moved through the unit, they had moments where they got to drill in and do some investigating about the animal that they had chosen. The how decisions are like those process-based decisions where we allow students to decide maybe how they go from point A to point B, give them a decision about what materials they use. Do they go online or offline? So if I'm a math teacher and we're practicing graphing, can I give students graph paper and say, hey, you can do this offline if you want that tactile experience, or you can log into Desmo's graphing calculator and do it there. Last but not least is giving them meaningful choice around the products they create to demonstrate their learning. So hopefully they understand why they're learning something so they can make an informed decision about what artifact they create to demonstrate learning or what pathway they choose to share and articulate their learning. So with my graduate students who are training to become teachers, we often start from this place of just like a would you rather option to keep this feeling manageable and sustainable. We don't have to give students 9, 10 choices or even 6 choices for it to be meaningful. It could literally be a would you rather option that gives them a choice where hopefully they can feel a bit more confident in their ability to complete whatever the task is. So it could be a simple choice as read or work alone, read or work with a partner, engage in a small group discussion, or journal about your thoughts, right? Work on your own or as part of a group. Make connections from the reading or video in a paragraph or a concept map. Take traditional notes, draw sketch notes, right? Write an explanation, record an explanation. So none of those options are actually that hard for me to provide students, and yet they can have a huge impact on student motivation. Now, for my coaches in the room and my teachers, this agency piece used to be like a big ask, right? It's like now I have to whip up multiple options. In the era of AI, we now have a thought partner that makes this so much easier to do, right? So teachers can save time building agency into their lessons with AI powered tools. So there are a ton of them. I have no doubt there will just be endless more popping up all the time. One of my go-tos is Magic School AI. If I'm not using that, half the time I'm just using ChatGPT and it works just great. And so you can actually ask the Magic School AI for multiple options related to a single topic, a single standard, a single learning objective to provide that meaningful choice without coaches or teachers spending a ton of time in that design work. So all I did is I actually went to Magic School AI. I chose, they have a ton of options. I chose the real world connection tool. And I focused on math because making those connections with math I think is incredibly important. The grade level standard I chose was 9. And then I told it, can you create 3 real world connections for 1 and 2 step equations in algebra, but pair each with a sample problem for students to solve. So now instead of 1 real world connection with 1 problem, I have one that has to do with solving equations for a recipe and a sample problem. I have one that's about budgeting and income with a sample problem. And there's one here about distance, speed, and time with a sample problem. So now I can give students 3 options and say, which one would you like to spend time on? And do you want to work on your own or do you want to work with a partner? Right? So, and if I don't love these, I just re-enter it and it generates more and other options for me. I want you guys to take about 3 to 5 minutes and I'll kind of roll around the room to kind of hear how you're doing. I want you to think about your class if you're a teacher in the room or a class you've been in as a coach or a school leader. And on your own, with a partner, whatever you prefer, generate at least one meaningful would you rather option for a content, process, and product kind of in that particular class. So just going through the motions of thinking this through, how might this remove barriers and help to appeal to different learning preferences? Because that's really the objective. So you can chat with a neighbor and you can capture your thinking in the playlist or on paper. You can share them on Mentimeter, and I will forward that Mentimeter slide so it's up there so we can kind of crowdsource some great ideas. And I'm gonna set that timer. If you have any questions as I'm walking around, call me over. But the more we think this through, the more you have tangible examples, the more likely you are to try this as a teacher or help your teachers to try it. All right, let's get started. All right. I'm gonna pull you guys back together. All right, so some good ideas shared on the Mentimeter. Thanks for the folks on Zoom putting your ideas in there, and the folks in here kind of throwing in what you're chatting about with your partners. So then let's get into differentiation. And really, when we talk about differentiation, I think of it as like those teacher moves we make to getting closer to meeting individual and small groups of learners where they're at in their learning journeys, making sure we're meeting their specific needs at a level that works for them so that all students are making progress toward firm, standard aligned goals. And this one also can help to boost student competence, right? So if we are really attempting to ensure that the learning activities are within their kind of scope of possibility, they are more likely to feel confident. So very similar to agency in terms of the kind of language we use, when I talk with teachers around how do we differentiate, what does this look like in practice, we talk about the difference between differentiating the content or how students access the information, how we differentiate the process or how they understand or make sense of this new information or content, and then the products, right? How they are going to demonstrate their learning or share or articulate their learning for us. So when I talk to teachers about thinking through how do students access the content, so many teachers in that whole group teacher-led, teacher-paced model are still relying heavily on lectures and mini lessons for the whole group, which can create a lot of barriers. If you ask teachers to think about what might make it hard for a student to access information when it presented live for the whole class, the list of potential barriers goes on and on and on. So some of the ways we can differentiate the content are making sure that we have students have access to text they can actually read to learn things, right? Because when they're little, they're learning how to read, but when they're older, they're reading to learn. But if they don't understand what they're reading, it's hard for them to learn the content. And so we want to make sure that they can actually read and access the text we're providing. We may give them options about whether they read or access an audio recording of a reading of a particular text to access it. It may be that we want to kind of expose them to an idea or an issue or a phenomenon. And so we find an article, a video, or like a podcast that they can listen to. This is another place where AI can be so helpful, is to actually ask it for recommendations of, can you recommend articles, videos, podcasts on this particular topic for this particular age range? This one, as a coach, I will say I get some pushback on video instruction versus small group instruction, because teachers are like, wait, if I'm going to do the small group instruction, why do I have to make a video too? That takes time, and per our word cloud, that's not something we have a lot of. But I try to kind of reinforce, like, there are some kids who a video is going to be plenty, and they're going to do well self-pacing through it, where they can pause, rewind, catch up on their notes. Maybe we pair it with a guided note template, wrap it in an ed puzzle. And there are some students, and I think particularly about my own second language learners, that needed more than that. And so I would allow the majority of my class to self-pace through a video, and I would pull small groups of students who needed more support from me. But once they had gotten that scaffolded, differentiated instruction in small group, everybody had access to that video if they needed that repeat exposure to hear it again. Accessing additional demonstrations and models, and obviously providing reteach for kids who are just going to need it. So like I said, sometimes when I'm working with a teacher, videos are a little easier for them to curate. They're used to going on YouTube or looking for videos in specific places, not as much podcasts. But I show my teachers, okay, if you're looking for a podcast, so can you generate a list of podcasts appropriate to a middle school audience focused on identity and exploring one's identity, right? And it spits out, this is like half of the list of ideas it gave me. So the thing that I've learned about using AI as much as I do is the output is only as good as the input. So we have to be super specific about the type of resource we're looking for, the age of the student that we're hoping to kind of target to make sure it's appropriate, the topic or focus of whatever the resource is that we're looking for. Another thing to think about is really using kind of some of those AI tools, like the Magic AI has something called a text leveler tool, where you can copy and paste a text in. I've set it for 3rd grade, and it will spit out a 3rd grade level version. And if I'm like, that's still like, there's some kids who are ready for more than that. I'm like, okay, I want a 3-paragraph version. And you know what? I have some kids in my class who are not going to be able to access an English text. So I'm going to use that beta and I'm going to translate it into Spanish, right? So now I have all of this control over the text that my students are reading if I really want them all to be able to access that particular text. And as we move away from that whole group teacher-led, teacher-paced instruction and embrace that small differentiated group instruction, maybe using a model like the station rotation, which is one of my favorites, or if you have students self-pacing through a choice board and you're pulling small groups, or you have some of the class working through a video and you're pulling small groups. This is our opportunity as teachers to really differentiate the instruction and the modeling sessions so that we're really cognizant of what are those problems and prompts we're pulling? Are they at an appropriate level of rigor, readiness, complexity? What scaffolds and supports might students in each group need in order to access the information or successfully solve a particular kind of problem? And what level of support do I want to make sure they have from me in this small group setting? Then we have differentiating the process, or how students kind of make sense of this new information, how they categorize it, make connections. And so thinking about even just giving them simple choices about whether they work on their own, with a partner, as part of a small group, what level of peer support will help them to make sense of this new information. Thinking about tiered activities where they're all working on the same instructional tasks, but maybe at different levels of rigor and complexity. Maybe they have variable timing, and obviously control over time is one of those benefits of blended learning. So can we start to think flexibly about giving students more or less time on task in the lesson? What would that look like? How could we make that happen? And then access to additional supports, things like working with manipulatives, having access to word banks, deconstructed models, guided note templates, graphic organizers, concept maps. All of those things can aid comprehension, right? And so when we're working, to design our lessons, if we're teachers, if we're supporting a teacher in the lesson planning process, what are those supports and scaffolds might we want to be working on together in order to ensure all students can really make sense of this new information and contextualize it in the larger picture that is our curriculum? And then differentiating the products, really thinking about, and I'm a realist, I know sometimes you just got to take the test, sometimes you just got to write the essay. A lot of teachers will push back and say, Catlin, I'm preparing them for a test, or Catlin, I have to have them writing. And I'm like, I get it. But every time, right? Because I'll tell you, as an English teacher, when the only way to demonstrate if they could analyze a text was in writing, a lot of my students were not successful if that was the only pathway. And analyzing a text is actually a reading skill, but I was only assessing it through writing. Then I realized, you know what, for some students, if they sat with me and talked me through the text and broke it apart and analyzed it verbally, they could do that. So it's about thinking through where can we provide those different pathways to demonstrate their learning. If we're asking them to create artifacts of their learning, kind of like you guys were brainstorming on the Mentimeter, was like, okay, do you want to create this output or this output to demonstrate your learning? Would you like to write, or do you want to record a podcast? So it's about trying to appeal to different interests, strengths, preferences. Again, starting to get a little more elastic the way we think about timelines, the amount of teacher support students are getting when they're working on a product, even kind of considering who's the audience for a particular student's work. Is it just a teacher audience? Is it a class peer audience? Is it a school audience? Is it an online audience? Because that can make a difference too. So I included a couple resources in your resource document. This one is from my work with Dr. Katie Novak, and it's just this idea that when students are going to express what they know or articulate it, there are different forms that can take. So this is an action and expression choice board. So hopefully we're removing barriers. This is an example of a project choice board where we have students choosing how do you want to, or what do you want to create to demonstrate your learning. Are you a really kind of verbal person who doesn't mind public speaking, who wants to answer the essential question in a mini TED Talk and record it or deliver it live? For some students, that is going to sound like the most awful thing ever, right? For others, they're totally in for it. Some students are really tactile. They like working with their hands. Maybe they want to construct a model or build something. For our more tech-savvy students, maybe they want to design an infographic or a multimedia slideshow. For our writers, maybe they want to create a children's book and answer the essential question. So again, really thinking about how can we give meaningful choice when possible to allow students to demonstrate and share their learning in different ways. Now again, this was a big ask before AI, but just to give you an example of what's possible, I went into the Next Generation Science Standards and I was looking at the high school biology, and this is a focus of structure and functions, and there are these three kind of focus standards at the top. And what I love about them too is they even have kind of clarification statements and assessment kind of boundaries up at the top. But I just super simple for this demo went to Magic School AI. They have a choice board generator. I had never used it for an assessment choice board, but I thought, what the heck? So I go ahead and I choose 10th grade. I put learning objective or the kind of topic, which is structure and function. And then you see how detailed my input is, right? My input is create a 3-column assessment choice board to provide students with flexible pathways, 3 options per column, to demonstrate their learning. The first column should focus on assessing the students, and I literally copied the language from the standard right there. I did that for each of the columns, and it spits out an idea for a choice board. Obviously, as a teacher, I'm going to want to build out the explanations here. As you saw in my choice board, I would probably link to back-end scaffolds or video explanations as needed. But again, generating this stuff is so much easier to do than it has ever been before. So I want to give you guys 3 minutes to kind of think about this idea of differentiation, whether it's your class or a class you've been in. So on your own with a partner, use an AI tool and experiment with differentiating at least one of those 3 things: content, process, products. Go. Yes. That's straight from Universal Design. Yeah. Yeah. So it's always like the goal, like the belief is that all students can reach firm standard aligned goals instead of like, here's a standard, but like, you're just going to show proficiency to like this extent. It's like, no, they can all get there. It's just a matter. All right, so I'm gonna have you guys wrap up those conversations. So the last two sections, which I'm gonna fly through in our last 5 minutes together, because I promise I won't keep you guys later, and you have everything you need if you're excited to do a deep dive into any of these topics, is this concept of community, right? The more we embrace blended learning, the more we have to kind of trust our students to lead the learning more often, to regulate their own behavior, to engage with each other in kind, respectful, supportive ways. And so how do we kind of cultivate an exclusive learning community, a supportive learning community? Because that's really this third piece of the psychological needs puzzle that is behind motivation, which is relatedness. And so for me, my kind of approach is to just use a really clear framework, that kind of CASTLE framework around social emotional learning, because during COVID, one of my complaints was like, I'm so glad we're focusing on this, but it feels like an add-on. It doesn't feel woven into the fabric of the work we're doing. Yet, if we want to cultivate community, these are all things that we need to constantly be helping students to skill build around, right? So can we get them to start understanding their thoughts and their emotions and what they value as individuals? Can we help them to start managing their own behavior? Really kind of managing those emotions and their thoughts, making responsible and caring decisions in the classroom so they're not alienating or upsetting or hurting each other. Developing those relationship skills. Do they know how to engage with each other? Do they have opportunities to do that? And then social awareness, really getting them to understand the perspectives of others and empathize with others. So in your resource document, I have linked to a blog series I wrote where each of these things I kind of talk about, I flesh out anywhere from 3 to 5 different strategies teachers can use, really focusing on this isn't something extra, it's not something different. It's so important to even academic performance in a class, in addition to cultivating that community. It positively impacts all of these things: grades, test scores, attendance. It decreases that kind of emotional distress, the anxiety that we're seeing so prevalent in so many classrooms. It improves kind of attitudes about themselves and about others when they practice and hone these skills. It improves resiliency as well, which I think is really important in this moment. How do we cultivate really resilient students? And then helps them to develop stronger connections with each other in a classroom. So when we talk about self-awareness or the ability to understand their emotions, their thoughts, and their values, there's lots of different ways that we can do this. But even just starting class as part of your welcome activity, or before students engage in discussion, or before they collaborate, with a check-in, something that allows them to connect on a social level, can be very, very helpful. And I included that entire deck that you just saw in your resource document. Practicing skills like kind of the stop, right, with role playing, where students, they practice kind of stopping or pausing before responding or reacting. And this could be just a scenario that we present or scenarios they develop, taking that deep breath and becoming aware of their body and breathing, observing what's happening around them, and then proceeding mindfully. So there's all of these different strategies, and this could be something that we even frame within the curriculum that we're working with our students. It doesn't have to be this separate thing. We can provide scenarios related to what we're teaching. So in your slide deck that you guys have access to, I've kind of highlighted for each of them different strategies that I think are particularly helpful, right? A safe space reflection for when we make a decision that wasn't the best decision, right? Getting into how can we cultivate responsible decision making in the classroom, help students to develop those relationship skills. And for each of these, if there's like a template or a resource I have, they're all in your resource document for those of you who want to dig in a little deeper. And then last but not least was the inquiry. And I have linked, in case you have teachers who are like, I really want students diving into real world problems. I want them exploring essential questions. really using that 5 E's model can be one of the most powerful ways to build inquiry into a classroom, whether it's the sole focus of the work kids are doing for a series of days or even weeks, or whether it's kind of this parallel inquiry that complements the curriculum that the teacher is guiding students through, really getting students to ask questions and get engaged in that exploration. Because I think part of why curiosity disappears, honestly, is that students end up getting all of these answers to questions they didn't ask and solutions to problems they've never encountered. And over time, they just stop asking their questions. So how do we build that back in? So for my coaches and teachers in the room, if you guys are curious about any of these things, obviously you have no shortage of books, podcasts, blogs, feel free to explore. If anything on that resource document is unclear, feel free to reach out. Thank you guys for spending the hour with me. Have a wonderful rest of your day.